Thank you very much, Mrs. Drayton. We've just to review some of the very important points which you made so that we can keep them in mind. We see in our country the effects of corruption and the lack of accountability over the years reflected in our inability to diversify, in the state of our education system, of our primary health care, and in the sense of safety and security of the population. It is noted that the corrupt, in spite of a slew of legislation, which is not as effective as it should be, the corrupt escape the law, and some of the key frontline agencies cannot prosecute and should be able to, particularly the FIU, the PCA, and the Integrity Commission. You recommended, one, that the ability to gather evidence of these agencies, of the DPP's office and of these agents, the ability to gather evidence should be strengthened. The office of the DPP should be strengthened. The status of the PCI, of the Police Complaints Authority, the Integrity Commission, and the Financial Intelligence Unit should be reviewed and strengthened, and it is reiterated that they should have the ability to prosecute. You called for more aggressive activism and urged that the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute should lead the charge. You also pointed out that threats to national security include our day-to-day safety and security, and there is need for Cabinet and the National Security Council to evaluate what these threats to national security actually are. I now invite Mr. Dion Abdool, Chair of the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute, to present the CPI methodology and unveil the results of the CPI. Mr. Abdool.
Good morning. Mr. Martin Farrell, Vice Chair, Mrs. Helen Drayton, our featured speaker this morning, Dr. Thackeray Driver, President and CEO of the Energy Chamber, His Excellency Fernando Schmidt, Ambassador of Chile, His Excellency Tim Stew, a good friend of TTTI, the British High Commissioner, His Excellency Irene Pieces Brooke, members of the Diplomatic Corps or the heads of missions, representatives of international organizations and agencies in Trinidad and Tobago, Justice Melville Baird, Chairman of the Integrity Commission, officials of the Public Service, Mr. David West, my colleague and good friend, Chairman of the Police Complaints Authority, representatives of civil society organizations, former chairs of TTTI present today, I see Mr. Derek Murray, Mr. Victor Hart, members of the Board of Directors of TTTI, other specially invited guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. It falls to me to present the results of the 2017 CPI. But before I do, it would be remiss of me if I did not thank and commend His Excellency and Mrs. Drayton for their words this morning. Putting it as it is, calling a spade as a spade, and getting real. A few words stayed with me in the middle of all your analysis and your summaries of the detail that impact on our country in terms of corruption. Ms. Drayton, you said, corruption is the friend of poverty. Corruption is the friend of poverty. And for those of us who sit in this room and to whom these messages may go to, we will do well to ponder on those words when we look at the state of our own country. She mentioned Venezuela, for example, as a very graphic example of corruption being a friend of poverty. His Excellency, all those data that you gave us, the 2.6 trillion, it's stuck in my head. the link between corruption and terrorism and other matters that impact on our society, the building blocks of our communities, we will not forget easily. But let's see how all those things we mentioned impacted on our performance in the Corruption Perception Index. For those of you who were with us last year, you might recall the survey took into account an assessment of 176 countries. This year, it's of 180 countries or territories around the world. I must remind you, as I think Susan did, that this particular survey is conducted by Transparency International, our parent organization, which is based in Berlin, Germany. That organization is about 25 years old this year, and we are just about 21 years old, Mr. Boyd, Derek, Mr. Hart. So we are a bit younger than them, but we are still following through with the work that they are doing. Transparency defines corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. And this is a definition I always start my presentations with whenever I do transparency's business, if only to remind us how simple that definition is and how simple we can misuse the asset that is placed in our hands for trust. The word is entrusted power. And the other word is abuse of that entrusted power. Ponder on that as well. The global messages that Transparency International has sent out this year, and which TTI supports, you will note from the results, which you will see shortly, that despite the attempts to combat corruption by many countries, the results of the efforts are moving too slowly to see any significant change. In the last 6 years, many countries have still made no progress, some little progress. Some have improved their scores, as you see here, including Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal, and of course, the United Kingdom. What we have noted as well in our analysis of the results is that the countries with the lowest protections for the press and NGOs tend to have the worst rates of corruption. Again, we can cite our neighbor at length on those. I thought that I would share just a bit of the methodology of the CPI so that you will understand or have an understanding of how we have come upon these rankings and scores. The information, the data that is provided to Transparency is taken from several sources. To be a valid source, a credible source that Transparency will accept data from, the criteria is up there on the screen for you. So it includes, there must be a reliable and valid methodology by the data source. It must rank multiple countries on the same scale. They must all be on the same page. The ratings must be given for a substantial number of countries, and there must be a continuous and consistent assessment for at least 2 years, and so on. The data sources themselves. We have used 13 data sources, and for a country to be included in the CPI, at least 3 data sources must provide data to Transparency. The data has been collected over the previous 24-month period. And for Trinidad and Tobago in particular, the data sources, as in the past, have been the World Economic Forum, the World Justice Project, the Rule of Law Index, the Economist Intelligence Unit, country ratings, Global Insight country ratings, PRS, International Risk Guide, and for the first time this year, VDEM, or Varieties of Democracy Project. Technical methodology. Data sources will capture the assessment of experts and business executives on behaviors, corrupt behaviors in the public sector. The behaviors that are looked at include bribery, use of public office for private gain, state capture, and so on. They will also look at the technical methodology, and that is the systems that are in place to prevent corruption in a country. And these will include the enforcement capability, the prosecution of corrupt officials effectively, red tape and excessive bureaucratic burdens, and the existence of adequate laws on financial disclosure, conflict of interest prevention, and access to information. And I dare say, if you look at that last bullet point, you realize we have those laws in place, right? The highlights of the 2017 CPI. If I go there. Right. As you might recall, or if you are here for the first time, the index uses a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is highly corrupt and 100 is said to be clean, very clean. This year, or 2017, more than 2/3 of the countries assessed scored below 50. And as past year Derek Murray used to say, if you write an exam and you score under 50, you fail the exam, right? Right, Derek? So they're saying 2/3 of the countries assessed have made that failing grade. The average score is 43. However, in 2017, 81 countries improved their scores, compared to 62, which did not. The results themselves now. So this is the heat map. As usual, red indicates very hot. And we'll dive into some detailed results now. I like this map only because it gives us a global idea of what happens in terms of corruption. And for you to understand, the smaller the bubble, the better they are at dealing with the issues of corruption, the better they have performed in the CPI. And I dare say, if you look at the top of this screen, the smallest bubble is Western Europe, the European Union area. And that has, for the years gone by, been tradition. The rest of us in the world, from the Americas to Asia, to Middle East and Africa, fall below, and our bubbles are much larger. At the top of the CPI this year, the number 1 ranked country is New Zealand. But then we have the slew of Nordic countries again: Denmark, Finland, Norway, Switzerland, Sweden, and of course Singapore. Scoring very high, New Zealand made 89 and Denmark 88. At the bottom of the CPI, as I said, 180 countries were ranked. We have Somalia at number 180, and their score out of 100 was 9. As Ms. Gordon pointed out, the methodology was changed in 2012. So we have sought to track from 2012 to 2017 the major movers, positively and negatively. And you can see with the green arrow, Austria, United Kingdom, of course, Côte d'Ivoire. And look there, high in the ranking, Guyana, our neighbor, has moved positively upwards. Downwards, impacting within the Caribbean region, is St. Lucia, whose scores have gone downwards since 2012. As I've noted here, the experience that some countries that experience shrinking civic space, the area that we at TTTI operate in, curtail rights of expression and media tend to decrease in their CPI scores. It's very important to note that Transparency has noted a correlation between journalistic freedom, freedom to report and write, and the ranking in the CPI this year. Let's focus on our areas. Our area, the Americas. The highest ranked area in our region is Canada. Ms. Weiss, you'll be pleased to know, with a score of 82. In the Caribbean itself, the highest ranked small island state is Barbados, ranking 25, scoring 68. And as we look closely at the results for the Caribbean, looking at the results over the past years since 2012, you will note that Trinidad and Tobago has increased its score from last year by 6 points. So this year, we have scored 41. In 2016, it was 35. You'll note also Jamaica, the scores are 3 points ahead of us, 44. In 2016, it was 39. And Guyana, who we noted just now, a couple of slides ago, moved from 34 to 38. Venezuela is at the bottom of the list, scoring just 18 in 2017. If you look closely at these results, you'll note, however, that of the countries mentioned there, only Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana have moved upwards in terms of scores in 2012. Other countries in the Caribbean, including Barbados, have scored less than they scored, for example, in 2014, 2013, and 2012. These results require examination. The results require us to ponder where we are, and as you will hear shortly, I hope, in the discussion that follows, how we can sustain this upward trend in our scores. How can we take the steps, the measures outlined, I believe, by Ms. Drayton, and some of it by His Excellency Tim Stew, to ensure that we continue this upward trend. But more than that, we find ourselves with a passing grade, because even though we have improved by 6 points to 41, we are still under 50, right? We are still in that bottom two-thirds of the world where our grade is a failing one. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.